They mocked her at the gala, not until the billionaire kissed her and called her his wife. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to another journey of the heart. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this precious time with me today. I can already feel the love flowing between us as we prepare to dive into something truly special together. I am always overjoyed to see that my stories are touching your hearts. You know, your beautiful comments are my biggest reward, and knowing that I bring you happiness is the greatest blessing of all. Tell me, my family, how did you feel about the last story? Did it move your heart the way I hoped it would? I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now let's begin with love and emotion, shall we? At 28 years old, Pamela Davis had perfected the art of being invisible, not by choice, but by necessity. Every morning at 6:47 a.m. she would step out of her cramped studio apartment on Beacon Street, just 3 blocks from the prestigious Whitmore Academy where she worked as head librarian. The apartment cost her $1,800 a month, nearly her entire take-home salary, but it was the closest affordable housing to the academy, and Pamela couldn't afford a car. Her grandmother Esperanza would have been proud to see her granddaughter walking those historic Boston streets, heading to work at one of New England's most elite institutions. Esperanza Davis had arrived from Guadalajara in 1952 with nothing but a battered suitcase filled with books and an unshakable belief that education was the only path to freedom. She had scrubbed floors and cleaned houses to put Pamela's mother through college, and then worked double shifts at a textile factory to help fund Pamela's own education. Misha, Esperanza used to say, running her weathered fingers along the spines of the books that lined their small living room, knowledge is the one thing they can never take away from you. It doesn't matter if your shoes have holes or your dress is second-hand. When you speak with wisdom, the whole world must listen. But as Pamela walked through the imposing iron gates of Whitmore Academy each morning, she wondered if her grandmother had been wrong. Because in this world of marble halls and gilded traditions, knowledge seemed far less important than your last name, your trust fund, or the car you drove. The academy itself was a monument to old money and older traditions. Founded in 1847 by railroad baron Cornelius Whitmore, it sprawled across 47 manicured acres in the heart of Boston's most exclusive neighborhood. Gothic Revival buildings with ivy-covered walls housed classrooms where the children of senators, CEOs, and old money families received their education, alongside the sons and daughters of tech billionaires and hedge fund managers. Annual tuition alone cost $65,000, more than Pamela's entire yearly salary. That didn't include the additional fees for everything from writing lessons to private tutoring, or the expectation that families would contribute generously to the endless fundraising campaigns that kept the Academy's endowment growing. Every morning, Pamela watched the parade of luxury vehicles dropping off students. Bentleys purred alongside Maseratis in the circular driveway. Mothers in Chanel suits air-kissed their teenage children goodbye before being whisked away by private drivers. Fathers in handmade Italian suits discussed million-dollar deals on their phones while their children grabbed designer backpacks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And then there was Pamela, clutching her worn leather messenger bag, hurrying through the service entrance to avoid the morning rush of wealth and privilege that filled the main corridors. The library was her sanctuary, her kingdom, her escape from the constant reminder of everything she wasn't. Housed in the Academy's original building, the Whitmore Memorial Library contained one of the most impressive collections of rare books and manuscripts on the East Coast. First edition novels, hand-illuminated medieval texts, original documents signed by founding fathers, treasures worth millions of dollars that Pamela catalogued, preserved, and protected with the reverence they deserved. Her office was tucked away on the 3rd floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that most people never bothered to climb. From her small window, she could see the courtyard where students gathered between classes, their casual conversations about weekend trips to the Hamptons or family skiing vacations in Switzerland floating up like smoke from a different world. Pamela had earned her position through pure merit, master's degree in comparative literature from Columbia University, with a specialty in Latin American magical realism. Her thesis on the evolution of narrative structure in contemporary literature had earned highest honors, and her professors had predicted a brilliant academic career ahead of her. But academic careers required connections, recommendations from professors who moved in the right circles, and most importantly, the financial stability to pursue unpaid internships and low-paying research positions while building your reputation. With $85,000 in student loan debt and monthly payments that consumed nearly a third of her income, Pamela couldn't afford the luxury of pursuing her dreams slowly. She needed steady employment with benefits, and the Whitmore Academy librarian position had seemed like a perfect compromise, working with the books and literature she loved while earning enough to survive. What she hadn't anticipated was how completely invisible she would become in this world of entitled privilege. Every day, Pamela watched teenagers casually spend more on lunch than she made in a week. She organized rare manuscripts worth millions while wearing the same 3 professional outfits on rotation: a navy blazer with matching skirt, a charcoal gray dress that had seen better days, and a black ensemble she'd bought on sale 3 years ago and carefully maintained. And the parents, they looked through her like she was furniture. Expensive, necessary furniture, but furniture nonetheless. During parent-teacher conferences, she had watched mothers in fur coats discuss their children's reading assignments as if she weren't standing right there. They would lean across her desk to examine rare books, leaving fingerprints on priceless manuscripts while asking questions that revealed they had no real understanding of what they were looking at. "Is this one of those old books worth a lot of money?" one mother had asked last month, pointing at a first edition Mark Twain, with perfectly manicured nails that probably cost more than Pamela's monthly grocery budget. The woman wore diamonds that caught the light every time she moved, and her handbag bore the unmistakable logo of a designer whose products started at $5,000. "It's a first edition of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn," Pamela had explained patiently. "Published in 1885, with the original binding and illustrations. It's worth approximately $45,000, but its historical significance is truly immeasurable." The woman had nodded absently, already losing interest. "Well, just make sure Timothy doesn't damage it. We can't afford to replace expensive school property." She had said this while wearing a watch that could have bought 3 copies of the book she was worried about. In the Academy's social hierarchy, Pamela ranked somewhere between the maintenance staff and the substitute teachers. The tenured faculty treated her with polite professional courtesy, but she was never invited to their dinner parties or weekend gatherings. The administrative staff included her in necessary meetings, but excluded her from casual conversations about vacation plans or family celebrations. The students were the worst. Not because they were cruel, most of them simply didn't see her at all. She was the lady who worked in the library, as anonymous and interchangeable as the security guards or cafeteria workers. They would discuss their personal lives, their family dramas, their romantic relationships right in front of her as if she were a piece of equipment. Only occasionally did one of them acknowledge her expertise, usually when they needed help with a research project that their expensive tutors couldn't handle, or when they were struggling with an assignment that required actual knowledge rather than family connections. "Miss Davis," 17-year-old Charlotte Pemberton had said just last week, appearing at Pamela's desk with the harried expression of someone unaccustomed to academic challenges. "I need to write an essay about symbolism in contemporary literature, and Daddy's assistant said you might be able to help since you went to Columbia." Charlotte's daddy was currently serving his 2nd term as a U.S. Senator, and her family's name appeared on buildings throughout New England. Her casual mention of having an assistant help with homework assignments perfectly captured everything about Whitmore Academy that made Pamela feel like an outsider looking in. But Pamela had helped anyway, spending 2 hours walking Charlotte through the subtle layers of meaning in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work, watching the girl's face light up with genuine understanding for the first time. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had fallen in love with literature in the first place. The magic of watching someone discover that books weren't just words on a page, but windows into entire universes of human experience. Those moments made the daily indignities bearable. Almost. Her dreams of writing her own novel remained carefully tucked away in a folder on her laptop. Pages and pages of false starts and abandoned chapters that she worked on late at night when the loneliness of her small apartment became too overwhelming. She had stories to tell, voices that demanded to be heard, but between her full-time job and the exhaustion of constantly feeling like she didn't belong, Finding the energy to write felt impossible. The invitation that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to her desk by the Academy's secretary with the same casual indifference reserved for utility bills and junk mail. "Spring Gala invitation," the secretary had said, dropping the heavy cardstock envelope next to Pamela's coffee mug. "All department heads are required to attend." Required, not invited. Required. Pamela had opened the elegant invitation with growing dread. The Whitmore Academy annual Spring Gala, scheduled for the first Saturday in April. Black tie required, cocktails at 7, dinner at 8, dancing until midnight. All proceeds benefiting the Academy's scholarship fund and new library wing construction. Her job would be to manage the rare book auction, one of the evening's main fundraising events. She would smile politely, answer questions about provenance and historical significance, and watch wealthy donors bid hundreds of thousands of dollars on books while she calculated how many months of student loan payments each sale represented. But now there was a big problem. She only had one formal dress. It hung in her tiny closet like a reproach. A simple navy blue gown she'd bought at a discount store 2 years ago for her college roommate's wedding. It was perfectly adequate for a small ceremony in suburban Connecticut, but for the social event of the Boston season, for an evening where women would be wearing designer gowns that cost more than most people's cars, Pamela stared at the invitation, feeling the familiar weight of not belonging settle around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In 6 weeks, she would walk into that glittering ballroom wearing her discount dress and her grandmother's vintage pearls, surrounded by Boston's most powerful families, knowing that every person in the room could buy and sell her 1,000 times over. She had no idea that the evening of anticipated humiliation would become the night that changed her life forever. The afternoon of the gala, Pamela stood in front of her bathroom mirror, attempting to transform herself into someone who belonged at Boston's most exclusive social event. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied the drugstore makeup she rarely wore, a shade of lipstick that had seemed elegant in the fluorescent lighting of CVS but now looked garish against her olive skin. The navy blue dress hung on the back of her bedroom door like a judgment. She had tried it on 3 times in the past week, each fitting revealing new flaws she hadn't noticed before. The fabric was polyester, not silk. The cut was simple, bordering on plain. The hemline hit at an awkward length that screamed discount rack to anyone with an eye for fashion, but it was what she had, and it would have to be enough. Her grandmother's pearls provided the only touch of authenticity to her ensemble. Esperanza had worn them on her wedding day in 1954, and they had been passed down through 3 generations of Davis women. The clasp was slightly tarnished, and one pearl near the back was noticeably smaller than the others, but they carried the weight of family history and genuine love. As Pamela fastened the necklace around her throat, she whispered a quiet prayer to her grandmother's memory. "Help me get through this night with dignity, Abuela. Help me remember that my worth isn't measured by the price of my dress." The taxi ride to Whitmore Academy cost $37. Money Pamela couldn't really afford to spend, but the alternative, arriving via public transportation in formal wear, seemed even more humiliating. As they pulled up to the Academy's main entrance, she watched other guests emerging from limousines and luxury cars, their designer gowns flowing like liquid silk in the early evening light. The Academy had been transformed for the occasion. Thousands of white lights twinkled throughout the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. Red carpet runners led from the curb to the main entrance, where photographers waited to capture images of Boston's social elite for the society pages. Uniformed valets moved with practiced efficiency, whisking away Bentleys and Rolls-Royces to a discreet parking area hidden from view. Pamela paid her taxi driver and stepped onto the sidewalk, immediately feeling the weight of curious glances from other arriving guests. A woman in emerald green Valentino paused mid-conversation to examine Pamela's dress with barely concealed disdain. 2 men in impeccably tailored tuxedos looked right through her as if she were invisible. The main ballroom had been converted into something approaching fairy tale magnificence. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls draped in ivory silk. Round tables for 10 were dressed in crisp white linens, each centerpiece a masterpiece of white roses and trailing greenery that probably cost more than Pamela's monthly grocery budget. The auction display area occupied the entire east wall, with museum-quality lighting illuminating rare books, artwork and jewelry that represented hundreds of years of collected wealth. Pamela made her way to her assigned station, grateful for the familiar comfort of books and manuscripts. Her job was to oversee the literary auction items, answer questions about provenance and historical significance, and assist the professional auctioneers when bidding began later in the evening. At least here, surrounded by first editions and historical documents, she felt confident in her expertise. The crown jewel of the literary collection was a first edition of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, signed by the author himself during his 1982 visit to Harvard University. The book had been donated by a Whitmore Academy alumnus, whose family had personal connections to the Nobel Prize winner. Conservative estimates placed its value at $50,000, though passionate collectors might drive the price significantly higher. As guests began filtering into the auction area during the cocktail hour, Pamela found herself observing the complex social dynamics of Boston's elite. Women air-kissed each other while mentally cataloging designer labels and jewelry. Men discussed business deals and political connections with the casual ease of people accustomed to moving millions of dollars with a handshake. Young adults in their 20s and 30s clustered together, their conversations revolving around European vacations, art gallery openings, and charitable board positions that were more about social networking than actual philanthropy. The first indication that this evening would be different from her usual professional invisibility came when she overheard a group of women examining the jewelry display at the neighboring auction table. "Who chose these pieces?" asked a blonde woman whose diamond tennis bracelet caught the light with every gesture. "Some of them are quite lovely, but others seem so pedestrian." "Oh, that's just committee politics," replied her companion, a redhead in black Chanel, whose accent carried the unmistakable inflection of old Boston money. "You know how these fundraising events work. They have to include donations from everyone, even the less educated donors." Their conversation might have remained unremarkable, just another example of casual elitism that Pamela had learned to tune out, but then their attention shifted to her area of responsibility. "And look at this book display," the blonde continued, moving closer to Pamela's station. "I suppose they're trying to add some intellectual gravitas to the evening, but honestly, who buys old books anymore? Everything's digital now." "Well, some of these first editions are supposedly quite valuable," the redhead replied, picking up the Garcia Marquez volume without asking permission, and handling it with the careless confidence of someone who had never worried about replacing anything she might damage. "Though I can't understand why anyone would pay thousands of dollars for something you can download for free." Pamela stepped forward with her most professional smile. "Actually, that particular edition has tremendous historical significance beyond its monetary value." Garcia Marquez signed it during his Nobel Prize tour, and the inscription references his friendship with the donor's family during his time as a visiting professor. The women looked at her with the kind of polite attention typically reserved for museum tour guides, necessary but ultimately forgettable. "How interesting," the blonde said with practiced indifference. "And you are?" "Pamela Davis, head librarian here at the Academy. I'm responsible for the literary auction items this evening." "Oh, you work here," the redhead said, her tone shifting to the particular brand of patronizing kindness that wealthy people reserved for service workers. "How lovely that they let staff participate in these events." "Let staff participate?" As if Pamela's presence were a charitable gesture rather than a professional necessity. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 more women, all wearing gowns that could have financed a college education. The newest arrivals immediately began examining the auction items with the predatory attention of serious shoppers. "Ladies," the blonde called out to her friends, "come meet the librarian who's been telling us about these books." And then it happened. The moment that would have broken a weaker woman, but instead became the catalyst for everything that followed. "Oh my goodness," said a brunette in midnight blue Oscar de la Renta, her voice pitched loud enough to carry to nearby tables. "Is that her dress? Where on earth did she find something so quaint? It looks like something from a department store clearance rack," added another woman, not bothering to lower her voice. "I suppose not everyone can afford proper formal wear, but really, the Academy should provide dress code guidelines for the help." "Well, you can't expect the staff to understand appropriate attire for an event like this," the redhead said with false sympathy. Some people simply don't belong in our world. It's not their fault really, but it can be so awkward for everyone involved. The cruel laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. Pamela's cheeks burned with humiliation as she realized that other guests had begun to notice the commotion. Conversations at nearby tables paused as people turned to observe the entertainment provided by her obvious social inadequacy. But even as her face flamed with embarrassment, something deeper than pride kept her spine straight and her voice steady. These women could mock her dress, her background, her place in their social hierarchy, but they could not diminish her intelligence, her expertise, or her fundamental worth as a human being. "Excuse me," a deep voice said behind her, cutting through the women's laughter with quiet authority. "I believe you were about to tell me about the Garcia Marquez first edition." Pamela turned to find herself facing a tall man with dark hair and striking green eyes, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo that was clearly custom-tailored. Everything about him radiated wealth and confidence, from his platinum cufflinks to his handmade Italian shoes. But there was something in his expression, a genuine interest, a warmth that she hadn't seen from anyone else all evening. "Of course," Pamela replied, grateful for the interruption and the chance to focus on something she knew thoroughly. "This is actually one of the most significant pieces in tonight's collection." The group of women fell silent, suddenly aware that their entertainment had attracted the attention of someone who clearly belonged in their world. The man's presence shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation, reminding everyone present that social hierarchies could be complex and that making assumptions about people's importance could be dangerous. Richard Hager had arrived at the gala with the weary resignation of someone fulfilling social obligations rather than pursuing personal pleasure. At 32, he was the heir to Hager Enterprises, a real estate development company founded by his grandfather and built into a multi-billion-dollar empire by his father. His personal net worth of $2.3 billion made him one of the most eligible bachelors in New England, a status that brought more burden than benefit. He had been watching the cruel theater playing out around the book display with growing disgust. The casual cruelty of the women mocking the librarian reminded him of everything he disliked about his social circle. The assumption that wealth automatically conferred superiority, the lack of empathy for anyone outside their privileged bubble, the belief that money made them better human beings rather than simply more fortunate ones. But when he looked at the librarian herself, her dignified composure despite obvious humiliation, her professional grace under pressure, the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine interest, real curiosity about another human being. This was going to be the first genuine conversation he'd had all evening. Have you ever been in Pamela's position? A moment when you got humiliated and made to feel like you didn't belong? Let me know below. This particular edition has an extraordinary history. Pamela began, her voice growing stronger as she moved into familiar territory. Garcia Marquez signed it during his 1982 visit to Harvard, just weeks after winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. But what makes it truly special is this inscription here. She carefully opened the book to reveal the author's handwritten message in Spanish, her fingers handling the precious volume with the reverence it deserved. He wrote, "Para la familia Morrison, quienes me enseñaron que la magia existe en cada rincón de Boston." For the Morrison family, who taught me that magic exists in every corner of Boston. Richard leaned closer to examine the inscription, and Pamela caught a hint of expensive cologne mixed with something warmer, more personal. The Morrison family were the donors, she continued. James Morrison was Garcia Marquez's closest friend during his visiting professorship at Harvard. They would meet every Thursday evening to discuss literature, politics, and the nature of storytelling itself. Magical realism, Richard said thoughtfully, and Pamela felt a spark of surprise. Most people at these events knew book values but rarely understood literary significance. Garcia Marquez's ability to weave the fantastical into everyday reality. It's fascinating how he could make the impossible seem inevitable. Exactly, Pamela's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. He once said that reality in Latin America is so surreal that magical realism is simply journalism. The extraordinary hiding within the ordinary. waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond surface appearances. The group of women who had been mocking her moments earlier now stood in uncomfortable silence, realizing they had stumbled into a conversation far above their intellectual reach. The brunette in Oscar de la Renta shifted nervously, suddenly aware that her cruel comments had been overheard by someone whose opinion clearly mattered. "I've always been drawn to that concept," Richard continued, his attention focused entirely on Pamela. "The idea that there are layers of meaning beneath everything we see, that what appears mundane might actually be extraordinary if we just know how to look at it properly. Like Remedio's The Beautiful ascending to heaven while hanging laundry," Pamela said, referencing one of the novel's most famous scenes. "Or the plague of insomnia that makes an entire town forget the names of everything." Garcia Marquez understood that the most profound truths often come disguised as impossibilities, and that love can transform not just individuals, but entire realities, Richard added, his voice carrying a weight that suggested personal meaning behind the words. For a moment the ballroom around them seemed to fade. The crystal chandeliers, the designer gowns, the careful choreography of wealth and status, all of it became background noise to this unexpected meeting of minds. Pamela felt herself truly seen for the first time all evening, not as the help or the librarian or the woman in the discount dress, but as someone whose thoughts and insights had value. "Richard, darling, there you are." The spell was broken by a voice like crystalline champagne, beautiful, expensive, and slightly sharp around the edges. Pamela looked up to see a woman gliding toward them, with the fluid grace of someone trained from birth in the art of making an entrance. Victoria Ashford was breathtaking in the way that only unlimited resources and professional styling could achieve. Her midnight blue Valentino gown fit like liquid silk, emphasizing every curve while maintaining an air of sophisticated elegance. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, not the ostentatious display of new money, but the subtle magnificence of jewelry that had been in families for generations. Her blonde hair was swept into a flawless chignon that had probably required 3 hours and $500 to achieve, but it was her approach that spoke volumes about her character. She moved toward Richard with the possessive confidence of ownership, her smile bright and loving for anyone watching, but her eyes calculating as they assessed the situation she was interrupting. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Victoria continued, sliding her arm through Richard's with practiced ease. "Your father wants to introduce you to the Pemberton family, something about their hotel chain expansion into Europe." The message was clear and multifaceted. She belonged with Richard, she had access to his family, she understood the business and social connections that mattered in his world. And most importantly, she was reminding everyone present, especially Pamela, of the vast gulf between someone like her and someone like the librarian, who had temporarily captured his attention. Pamela felt herself shrinking back into invisibility, the magical moment of connection dissolving like morning mist. Of course Richard had a girlfriend. Of course that girlfriend was everything Pamela wasn't: wealthy, beautiful, perfectly at home in this world of privilege and power. "Victoria," Richard said, and Pamela noticed something in his tone she couldn't quite identify: politeness without warmth, acknowledgement without enthusiasm. "I was just learning about this Garcia Marquez first edition." Pamela was explaining the historical significance of the inscription. Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes briefly flicked to Pamela with the kind of assessment that could price a person's entire outfit in seconds. "How fascinating," she said with a particular inflection that managed to sound interested while conveying complete indifference. "I'm sure it's very educational." The dismissal stung, but Pamela had endured enough social slights to recognize when she was being relegated to her proper place in the hierarchy. She began to step back from the conversation, ready to resume her professional invisibility. "Actually," Richard said, his voice cutting through the awkward silence, "I was hoping to learn more. Pamela, would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? I have some first editions in my private collection that I think you'd find fascinating, and I'd love to continue our conversation about magical realism." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something cold and calculating before she recovered her composure. The group of women who had been eavesdropping on their conversation exchanged shocked glances. Several other guests within hearing range paused their own conversations to listen. Pamela felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Richard Hager, and it's not kindness, it's genuine interest. You clearly have a passion for literature that goes far beyond professional obligation. I'd consider it a privilege to hear more of your insights." "Richard," Victoria's voice carried just the slightest edge of warning. "Surely you remember we have plans tomorrow evening, the fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. You promised to attend with me. I'm sure they'll survive without me for one evening." Richard replied, not taking his eyes off Pamela. "This seems more important." The silence that followed was deafening. In the complex social mathematics of Boston's elite, Richard Hager had just publicly prioritized a conversation with a librarian over his obligations to the woman everyone assumed was his girlfriend. The implications rippled through the nearby crowd like stones thrown into still water. Pamela felt dizzy with the impossibility of the situation. Part of her wanted to accept, to explore this unexpected connection with someone who seemed to value her mind over her bank account, but the rational part of her brain, the part that had survived 28 years of being reminded of her place in the world, urged caution. "I appreciate the invitation," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure that would be appropriate. You're here with your girlfriend, and I'm working this evening. Perhaps it would be better if we kept our conversation professional." "Victoria isn't my girlfriend," Richard said loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "She's a family friend whose company I enjoy, but there are no romantic commitments between us." Victoria's face went white beneath her expertly applied makeup. In the cruel social calculus of their world, she had just been publicly demoted from potential wife to casual acquaintance. The women who had been mocking Pamela earlier now stared at Victoria with the fascinated horror of people watching a social execution. "Richard, you're being ridiculous," Victoria said, her voice strained but still attempting lightness. "Of course we're together. We've been dating for months, and our families have been discussing business arrangements," Richard interrupted. "That's entirely different from a romantic relationship, and you know it." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the drama unfolding at the book auction table. Conversations throughout the ballroom began to pause as people sensed that something significant was happening near the literary display. It was then that the auctioneer's voice rang out across the room, announcing that the evening's bidding would begin with the literary collection. Pamela felt a moment of relief. At least she would have something concrete to focus on instead of the surreal situation developing around her. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer called, "we'll start this evening with lot number 17, a signed first edition of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Opening bid is set at $15,000. Hands began rising around the room as serious collectors entered the competition. 20,000, 25,000, 30,000. The bidding moved quickly as the price climbed beyond what Pamela had expected. 40,000, called a voice from the back of the room. 45,000. Came another bid, and then Richard raised his hand. $50,000. The room fell silent. $50,000 was well beyond the book's estimated value, even accounting for its historical significance and perfect condition. It was the kind of bid that made a statement, though what that statement might be remained unclear. $50,000 from Miss Hager, the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear 55? Silence. No one was willing to compete with Richard Hager when he was clearly determined to win a particular item. "Sold to Mr. Hager for $50,000. Applause rippled through the crowd, but Pamela noticed the speculative glances and whispered conversations that followed. Richard had just spent $50,000 on a book immediately after asking its curator to dinner and publicly rejecting the woman everyone assumed was his girlfriend. As the auction moved on to the next item, Richard turned back to Pamela. "So," he said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased rather than triumphant, "I believe I'll need someone to tell me more about my new acquisition. Are you free for dinner tomorrow evening?" Behind the scenes, forces were already beginning to move in response to the evening's unexpected developments. Robert Hager, Richard's father and the driving force behind Hager Enterprises, had been watching the auction from across the room with growing concern. His son's public interest in the Academy Librarian, combined with his apparent rejection of Victoria Ashford, threatened months of careful planning for the company's expansion into European markets. Victoria's family, the Ashfords, controlled significant banking interests throughout Europe. A marriage between Richard and Victoria would open doors that money alone couldn't access, providing Hager Enterprises with the international connections necessary for their ambitious growth plans. Robert had been cultivating this relationship for over a year, convinced that Victoria was the perfect strategic match for his son. But what Robert Hager didn't know, what no one in that glittering ballroom suspected, was that Victoria's interest in Richard had nothing to do with love or even social advancement. The Ashford family's banking empire was crumbling under the weight of hidden debts and fraudulent investments that had been concealed from regulators for months. Victoria needed access to the Hager fortune, not to enhance her lifestyle, but to save herself from financial ruin and potential criminal charges. She had spent weeks studying Richard's preferences, learning his interests, crafting the perfect persona to attract his attention. Her knowledge of art, her appreciation for literature, her understanding of business, all of it was carefully researched performance designed to make him fall in love with an illusion. But now, watching him bid $50,000 on a book, just to continue a conversation with a librarian who wore discount store dresses, Victoria realized that her carefully laid plans were in serious jeopardy. She had perhaps weeks, maybe less, before her family's financial crimes were discovered. She needed Richard's proposal, needed access to his accounts, needed to be legally positioned to transfer assets before the federal investigators closed in. The librarian had to be eliminated as a threat, whatever it took. Meanwhile, 3 weeks after the gala, Pamela's small apartment had become something she never expected, a sanctuary where the outside world's judgments couldn't reach. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Richard would arrive at her door carrying takeout from different restaurants around the city, insisting that she choose the cuisine, and refusing to let her worry about the cost. "You realize this Thai food probably costs more than my weekly grocery budget," Pamela said one evening, unpacking containers of pad Thai and green curry from Boston's most exclusive Thai restaurant. "And you realize I don't care about the money," Richard replied, settling onto her second-hand couch with the ease of someone who had grown genuinely comfortable in her modest space. "I care about having real conversations with someone who challenges my thinking instead of just agreeing with everything I say." Her apartment, with its cramped kitchen and mismatched furniture, had become their retreat from the pressures of his world. Here, surrounded by Pamela's towering bookshelves and the soft lighting from discount store lamps, Richard discovered parts of himself he had forgotten existed. They would spend hours discussing literature, philosophy, dreams deferred, and passions abandoned. "I wanted to be a teacher originally," Richard confessed one evening, wine making him more open than usual. "High school English. I loved the idea of sharing great literature with young minds, watching them discover that books could change how they saw the world." "What stopped you?" Pamela asked, curled up in the corner of her couch with a copy of Love in the Time of Cholera balanced on her knees. "Reality. Responsibility. My father built Hager Enterprises from nothing, worked 18-hour days to create something lasting for our family. How could I tell him I wanted to abandon all of that to teach teenagers about metaphors and symbolism?" "Who says you have to abandon anything?" Pamela challenged. "You could fund educational programs, create scholarships, build schools. There are ways to honor your father's legacy while pursuing your own passions." These conversations revealed a Richard that no one in his social circle had ever seen: thoughtful, uncertain, hungry for meaning beyond quarterly profits and business expansion. Pamela found herself falling not for his wealth or status, but for his curiosity, his genuine desire to understand different perspectives, his willingness to question assumptions he had never examined before. But their growing connection was creating ripples that neither of them could control. Robert Hager had been patient for exactly 2 weeks before demanding a private meeting with his son. The conversation took place in Robert's corner office on the 42nd floor of the Hager Enterprises Tower, Boston sprawling beneath them like a map of their family's success. "This has gone far enough, Richard," Robert said without preamble. "Your infatuation with this librarian is becoming an embarrassment to our family and a threat to our business interests." My personal relationships are not business assets, Dad. Everything is a business asset when you're the heir to a multi-billion-dollar company, Robert shot back. Victoria Ashford represents access to European banking networks that could increase our international revenue by 40% within 2 years. Her family has connections we've spent decades trying to cultivate. And what about love? What about compatibility? What about marrying someone I actually trust and respect? Robert's laugh was harsh. Love is a luxury for people who don't have empires to maintain. I didn't love your mother when I married her. I respected her, appreciated her intelligence, valued her contribution to our family's success. Love came later, built on shared goals and mutual respect. That's not what I want for my life. What you want is irrelevant. What our family needs, what our employees depend on, what our shareholders expect, that's what matters. Marry Victoria, secure the European expansion, and then pursue whatever romantic fantasies you need on the side. But this public relationship with a nobody who brings nothing to our table ends now. The ultimatum was clear, and Richard left his father's office feeling the weight of expectations that had been building his entire life. But instead of ending his relationship with Pamela, he found himself more determined than ever to protect what they were building together. Victoria, meanwhile, was waging her own campaign of destruction. She had spent years perfecting the art of social manipulation, and she deployed every weapon in her arsenal against Pamela's reputation. At charity luncheons and gallery openings, she planted seeds of doubt and malicious gossip with surgical precision. "I'm so worried about Richard," she would confide to influential women whose opinions shaped Boston society. "This librarian person seems to have such a hold over him. His father is concerned that she's targeting him for his money." The rumors spread like wildfire through their interconnected social circles. Pamela was painted as a calculating opportunist who had researched Richard's interests and manipulated him into thinking they shared genuine connections. Her modest background became evidence of desperation rather than authenticity. Her intelligence was reframed as cunning designed to exploit a wealthy man's loneliness. She studied his preferences, Victoria told Mrs. Pemberton at a museum board meeting, found out about his interest in literature and positioned herself as some kind of intellectual. It's actually quite clever, if you think about it. These working-class women can be very strategic when they smell money. The gossip reached Pamela through well-meaning colleagues who thought she should know what was being said about her. Each report felt like a physical blow, not because she cared about the opinions of people who had never bothered to know her, but because she could see how the mounting pressure was affecting Richard. He grew quieter during their dinners together, more distracted, clearly wrestling with conflicts he didn't fully share. She began to wonder if continuing their relationship was fair to either of them when it was causing him such obvious stress. But Richard was fighting battles Pamela didn't even know about. Disturbed by Victoria's sudden campaign to discredit the woman he was falling in love with, he had quietly hired a private investigator to look into the Ashford family's financial situation. The results were shocking beyond anything he had expected. The Ashford banking empire, built over 4 generations and spanning 3 continents, was essentially bankrupt. Fraudulent loans, money laundering operations and systematic theft had hollowed out the institution from within. Federal investigators were already building a case that could result in criminal charges for multiple family members. Victoria wasn't just socially ambitious, she was financially desperate. Her pursuit of Richard had nothing to do with love or even social climbing. She needed access to his accounts, needed legal authority to transfer assets, needed to steal enough money to disappear before the authorities closed in. The investigators' report painted a picture of calculated deception that made Richard's blood run cold. Every conversation they'd shared, every interest she'd claimed to have, every gesture of affection had been researched and performed. She had studied him like a mark, learned his weaknesses, crafted the perfect persona to manipulate his emotions. "She's been planning this for months," the investigator explained during their confidential meeting. "Created a detailed profile of your interests, your values, your family relationships, even tracked your social media activity to understand your personality patterns." The revelation transformed Richard's understanding of the past year. Victoria's sudden interest in literature, her appreciation for his business insights, her patient tolerance of his reluctance to commit. All of it was performance designed to position herself for theft on a massive scale. But the most chilling discovery was the timeline. Federal investigators were closing in faster than Victoria probably realized. She had weeks, maybe less, before her family's crimes were exposed, which meant she was running out of time to execute whatever plan she had for accessing the Hager fortune. Victoria's desperation was becoming dangerous. Richard could see it in her increasingly frequent attempts to manipulate him into proposal, her growing agitation when he resisted her pressure, her barely concealed fury whenever Pamela's name was mentioned. Robert Hager, unaware of his son's investigation, had been working with Victoria to arrange a public proposal that would cement their engagement and give her immediate access to family resources. They had settled on the Academy's spring fundraiser as the perfect venue, the same event where Richard and Pamela had first met. "It will be beautifully symbolic," Victoria had told Robert during one of their planning sessions. "Where your son learned about his responsibilities to family and business, he'll make the commitment that secures our future together. Son, that will be the perfect moment. You must propose and secure this merger," Robert told Richard at his office. But now Richard already knew that Victoria's definition of our future involved federal prosecution for his family and financial ruin for everyone who trusted her. The woman his father believed would save their business expansion was actually planning to destroy everything they had built. The confrontation was inevitable. Victoria's timeline was collapsing, federal investigators were closing in, and Richard was growing more certain every day that his future lay not with a calculated criminal, but with a librarian who loved him for who he was rather than what she could steal from him. Pamela, unaware of the criminal conspiracies swirling around her, continued to face increasing social hostility with quiet dignity. She attended faculty meetings where colleagues whispered about her inappropriate relationship with a donor. She endured pointed questions from parents who had heard rumors about her gold-digging schemes. She watched former friends distance themselves to avoid being associated with scandal. But she also felt something she had never experienced before: unconditional love from someone who valued her mind, her character, her authentic self. Whatever storms were gathering around them, whatever pressures Richard faced from his family and social circle, she was determined to face them with the same strength her grandmother had taught her. The spring fundraiser was 2 weeks away. Victoria's crimes were about to be exposed. Robert Hager was expecting a proposal that would secure his business empire, and Richard was preparing to make choices that would define not just his future, but the future of everyone he loved. The dangerous game was reaching its climax, and only one player would emerge victorious. The Whitmore Academy spring fundraiser arrived with all the pomp and circumstance of the previous gala, but for Pamela Davis, everything had changed. She walked through the same iron gates, past the same red carpets and glittering lights, but this time she carried herself with a confidence born from weeks of being loved for exactly who she was. Her dress was still modest by the standards of Boston's elite, a deep emerald green that she had found on sale at Nordstrom Rack, but she wore it with the grace of someone who no longer measured her worth by the price of her clothing. The promotion to head librarian had come with a small salary increase, enough to afford one genuinely beautiful dress and professional styling that made her feel polished rather than apologetic. Richard had offered to buy her anything she wanted, to hire stylists and personal shoppers, but Pamela had refused. "I need to walk into that room as myself," she had told him, "not as some version of myself that money created." The ballroom was identical to the scene of their first meeting: crystal chandeliers, white roses, auction tables displaying treasures worth millions. But the energy felt different, charged with undercurrents of anticipation and barely suppressed drama. Word had spread through Boston's social circles that something significant might happen tonight, though no one was quite sure what. Victoria Ashford had arrived early, positioning herself strategically near the entrance to greet guests and remind everyone of her connection to the Hager family. She wore red Valentino, a bold choice that signaled confidence and celebration, and a diamond necklace that had belonged to her great-grandmother. What the assembled crowd didn't know was that she had borrowed the necklace from a private dealer, using forged documents to access family assets that were already frozen by federal investigators. Her time was running out. The FBI had contacted the Ashford family's attorneys that morning, requesting a meeting that could only mean one thing. The criminal investigation was entering its final phase. Victoria had perhaps days before arrest warrants were issued, which meant tonight was her last chance to secure access to the Hager fortune. Robert Hager moved through the crowd with the satisfaction of a man who believed his carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. He had coordinated with Victoria to ensure that Richard would be cornered tonight, pressured into a public proposal that would secure both their business expansion and his son's romantic future. Everything is arranged, Victoria had assured him during their final planning call. The photographer is ready, the ring is selected, and I've made sure all the right people will be here to witness Richard's commitment to our family's future. But Richard was also making preparations, though his were of an entirely different nature. The FBI had briefed him earlier that day about Victoria's crimes and her plan to use marriage as a cover for massive theft. Special Agent Catherine Monroe had been blunt about the danger. "She's desperate, Mr. Hager. Desperate people make unpredictable choices. We need you to help us get a confession, but if she realizes you know the truth, she could become dangerous." As guests began filtering into the ballroom, the same social dynamics that had humiliated Pamela 3 months earlier began playing out again. The same groups formed, the same conversations about business deals and European vacations, the same casual displays of wealth and privilege. But this time, when Victoria gathered her circle of friends around the auction tables, their target wasn't just Pamela's clothing or background. The rumors Victoria had been spreading for weeks had crystallized into a coordinated campaign of character assassination. "I still can't believe Richard is actually here with that woman," declared the blonde who had mocked Pamela's dress at the first gala. "After everything we've heard about her calculating behavior, you'd think he would have come to his senses. My husband spoke to Robert Hager last week," added the redhead in black Chanel. "Apparently the family is beside themselves. They've tried everything to make Richard see reason, but she has some kind of hold over him." Victoria positioned herself at the center of the conversation, her voice pitched to carry to nearby tables. "I feel so sorry for Richard, honestly. He's such a good man, so trusting and generous. He can't see that she researched his interests, studied his preferences, manipulated every conversation to make him think they have some deep connection." "It's textbook gold digging," chimed in another woman. "She targeted him specifically because of his wealth, learned everything about his family business, and now she's probably pressuring him for access to financial accounts." The accusations were delivered with the cruel satisfaction of people who enjoyed destroying reputations, but they were also strategic. Victoria needed to publicly establish Pamela as untrustworthy before her own crimes were exposed. If she could paint the librarian as a manipulative opportunist, it would be easier to position herself as Richard's protector. Pamela heard every word. She had been arranging auction items at a nearby table, and the women's voices carried clearly across the space between them. For a moment she felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the urge to retreat into invisibility that had protected her for so many years. But then she remembered Richard's words from their dinner the night before. "They're going to try to tear you down because they're threatened by what we represent. Don't let them make you smaller to accommodate their insecurity." She turned to face Victoria and her circle directly, her voice clear and steady. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about me. If you have concerns about my character or my relationship with Richard, perhaps you should address them directly rather than spreading rumors to people who don't actually know me." The group fell silent, shocked that their target had dared to confront them. Victoria's mask of sweet concern slipped for a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "We're simply worried about a friend," Victoria replied with false sweetness. "Richard means so much to our community, and we hate to see him taken advantage of by someone who doesn't understand our world." "Your world?" Pamela's voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "You mean a world where people's worth is measured by their bank accounts rather than their character? Where spreading malicious gossip is considered acceptable behavior? Where someone like you can manipulate and deceive while accusing others of the very crimes you're committing?" Victoria's face went white. "How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth. Stand up for myself. Refuse to be intimidated by people who mistake wealth for wisdom." The confrontation was drawing attention from across the ballroom. Conversations paused as people turned to observe the drama unfolding near the auction tables. The annual fundraiser was providing entertainment that no one had expected. "Ladies, is there a problem here?" Richard's voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. He appeared beside Pamela, his hand settling protectively on her lower back, his presence immediately shifting the power dynamic of the confrontation. But this time, Richard wasn't just defending Pamela from social cruelty. He was armed with information that would expose Victoria's true nature to everyone present. "Actually, Richard, there is a problem," Victoria said, quickly switching to her practiced tone of loving concern. "Your friend here has been making wild accusations about our conversation. I think the stress of being in our social circle might be affecting her judgment." "My judgment is fine," Pamela replied before Richard could respond. "I know exactly what I heard, and I know exactly what you've been telling people about me for weeks." "Victoria," Richard said, his voice carrying an edge that made several people step closer to listen. "Perhaps it's time we discussed your real motivations for being here tonight." Something in his tone made Victoria's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. "I don't know what you mean. I'm here because I care about you, because I love you, because our families, Richard interrupted. "You mean your family that's currently under federal investigation for fraud? Your family whose banking empire is bankrupt from years of criminal activity? Your family whose assets were frozen by the FBI this morning?" The collective gasp was audible across the ballroom. Conversations stopped entirely as people strained to hear what was happening at the center of the drama. Victoria's face cycled through shock, panic, and finally desperate calculation. "Richard, you don't understand. Those are just accusations, false charges from competitors who want to destroy us. I need your help, your family's support, to fight these lies. The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for months," Richard replied, his voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd of onlookers. "About your feelings for me, about your family's finances, about your real plans for gaining access to Hager assets." The pieces were falling into place for the assembled guests. Victoria's sudden interest in Richard, pressure for commitment, her campaign against Pamela, all of it was beginning to make horrible sense. "But we're supposed to be together," Victoria said, her voice rising with desperation. "Your father arranged everything, the proposal, the announcement, our future. Richard's laugh was harsh. "Victoria, the FBI told me about your plan to drain Hager accounts after we married. They have documentation of your family's criminal activities going back years. You don't love me, you were planning to rob me." The revelation rippled through the crowd like an electric shock. Boston's social elite found themselves witnessing the exposure of a criminal conspiracy that had been hiding behind elegant gowns and charity fundraisers. But Richard wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire ballroom, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision that would change everything. "I have an announcement to make," he said, drawing Pamela closer to his side. "Victoria has been spreading rumors about the woman I love, trying to convince everyone that Pamela is manipulative and calculating. But the only person here who fits that description is Victoria herself." He paused, looking directly at the woman who had tried to destroy his happiness while planning to destroy his family. "Pamela isn't my girlfriend or my romantic interest," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "She's my wife," he said as he turned, now cupping her face as he leaned closer and kissed her passionately. "We were married last week in a private ceremony, and I've never been happier or more certain of anything in my life," he continued after they finally parted. The lie came so naturally, delivered with such conviction, that for a moment even Pamela almost believed it. But she understood immediately what Richard was doing, protecting her reputation, while ensuring that Victoria could never claim any legal right to Hager assets. Victoria swayed on her feet, her carefully laid plans crumbling around her. The FBI agents who had been stationed discreetly around the ballroom began moving forward, their investigation having gathered enough evidence for arrest. "Victoria Ashford," Agent Monroe announced, stepping forward with handcuffs. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering and attempted theft. You have the right to remain silent." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, the ballroom erupted in shocked conversations. Robert Hager, who had been watching the confrontation from across the room, approached his son with a mixture of relief and admiration. "What just happened, son?" Robert said quietly. "You've just saved our family from disaster." The fairy tale ending had arrived not through magic but through courage, integrity, and the power of love to triumph over calculated deception. Pamela Davis, the invisible librarian who had been mocked and dismissed, had become the woman who helped expose a criminal conspiracy while winning the heart of the man who saw her true worth. As they left the gala early, walking hand in hand toward a future built on genuine love rather than social obligation, Pamela realized that sometimes the most beautiful victories come disguised as humiliation, and the most powerful magic is simply the courage to be authentically yourself. 6 months later, the Whitmore Memorial Library had been transformed into something approaching a fairy tale. White roses and ivy wound around the ancient oak shelves, while soft candlelight reflected off the leather spines of countless first editions. The wedding ceremony was intimate, just 30 guests seated among the books that had brought Pamela and Richard together. Pamela wore her grandmother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her frame, with Esperanza's pearls completing the ensemble. As she walked down an aisle lined with literary treasures, she carried a bouquet of white roses wrapped in pages from damaged poetry collections, her tribute to the power of words to transform lives. Richard waited for her beside the circulation desk where they had shared their first real conversation about Garcia Marquez. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, surrounded by stories of love that had endured far longer than the society scandals that had once threatened to keep them apart. Robert Hager sat in the front row, his eyes bright with unshed tears. After the ceremony, he approached his new daughter-in-law with the humility of a man who had nearly made a catastrophic mistake. "Pamela, I need to apologize," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When Richard made that announcement at the gala, when he claimed you were already married, I was furious. I thought he had destroyed months of careful planning, ruined our chance at European expansion, humiliated our family in front of Boston's most important people." He paused, looking at his son with newfound respect. "I was ready to disown him for what I saw as a public act of rebellion against everything I had worked to build. But then I watched Victoria's face when those handcuffs closed around her wrists. I saw the guilt, the desperation, the cold calculation that had been hiding behind her perfect smile. And I realized that my son hadn't destroyed our future, he had saved it. The federal investigation had revealed the full scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise. The Ashford banking empire had been built on decades of fraudulent loans, money laundering operations, and systematic theft from clients' accounts. Victoria herself faced charges that could result in 25 years in federal prison, her elegant facade replaced by orange jumpsuits and handcuffs. "She would have bankrupted us within a year," Robert continued, "stolen everything we built, destroyed our reputation, left our employees without jobs and our investors without recourse. You didn't just win Richard's heart, you saved our entire family from ruin." Pamela's transformation over those 6 months had been remarkable to witness. The invisible librarian who had once hurried through service entrances now walked confidently through the academy's main halls, greeting parents and faculty with the assurance of someone who knew her worth wasn't determined by others' opinions. Her new position as director of literary programs came with both increased responsibility and increased respect. She had launched innovative educational initiatives, secured major donations for the library's expansion, and earned recognition as one of Boston's most effective cultural administrators. But the most significant change was internal. The woman who had once shrunk from social confrontation now advocated fearlessly for her students, her programs, and her values. She spoke at conferences about literature's power to bridge social divides, served on boards dedicated to educational equity, and used her platform to ensure that other young women wouldn't feel invisible in worlds that claimed to value only wealth and connections. The autumn gala marked their first public appearance as a genuinely married couple, and the difference in atmosphere was striking. The same ballroom, the same crystal chandeliers, the same society figures who had once dismissed Pamela as irrelevant, now competed for her attention and approval. She wore midnight blue silk, still elegant rather than ostentatious, but clearly expensive and perfectly tailored. Most importantly, she wore it with the confidence of a woman who no longer needed external validation to know her worth. The auction that evening featured a special item that made both Richard and Pamela smile: the signed Garcia Marquez first edition that had started their love story. Richard had donated it back to the Academy with the stipulation that proceeds benefit scholarships for first-generation college students. "This book brought us together," he explained to the assembled crowd. "It seems fitting that it should help other young people discover the transformative power of literature and education." When the bidding reached $55,000, Pamela felt a rush of satisfaction that had nothing to do with money. The book that had once represented everything she couldn't afford had become a symbol of love's ability to transcend artificial barriers. As they danced together in the same ballroom where cruel women had once mocked her discount dress, Pamela reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She was still the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants, still passionate about books and learning, still someone who chose substance over superficiality. But now she was also Miss Richard Hager, partner to a man who valued her mind and character above all else, and a woman who had learned that true belonging comes not from others' acceptance, but from accepting yourself completely. "You ever miss your old life?" Richard asked as they swayed to the music. "Never," Pamela replied without hesitation. "That wasn't living, it was just surviving. This is the first time I've ever felt truly seen, truly valued, truly whole." The fairy tale was complete, but it wasn't the kind found in children's books. This was a story about real love triumphing over social prejudice, about integrity defeating criminal deception, about a woman who refused to be diminished by others' limitations. As the evening wound down, they walked hand in hand through the Academy gardens where Pamela had once eaten solitary lunches, feeling like an outsider looking in. Now those same paths led to a future built on genuine partnership, shared dreams, and the unshakable foundation of being loved exactly as you are. The invisible woman had become invaluable, not by changing who she was, but by finding someone who could finally see her clearly. My precious family, if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that your worth isn't determined by your zip code or your wardrobe, then please share it with someone who needs this reminder. Hit that subscribe button, because we're building a family where everyone belongs, where every story matters, and where love always wins over calculation. And remember, you are not invisible, you are not less, you are exactly who you're meant to be, and the right people will see your light. Until our next story, carry this truth with you. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin with the worst days. I love you, I believe in you, and I'm praying for your happiness.